Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Learn to Love podcast, your guide to everything love, sex, intimacy, and relationships. Each week, your host, Zach Beach, interviews new experts on love, including couples therapists, relationship coaches, sex educators, and best-selling authors. Learn the best tips and cutting-edge wisdom to better love yourself, others, and the world. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, beautiful souls. I'm so positively delighted that you could join us on the Learn to Love podcast. I am your host, Zach Beach, and I'm excited to introduce our guest for today's episode, Kristal DeSantis. Kristal is a licensed marriage and family therapist based in Austin, Texas, known for her expertise in couples, trauma, and sex therapy. With a focus on supporting first responder couples and addressing men's issues, Kristal offers a unique therapeutic approach rooted in understanding male psychology and the challenges faced by men in contemporary society. Kristal's insights have been featured in publications such as Newsweek, Huffington Post, The Good Men Project, and Time. And she has appeared on podcasts discussing masculinity, mental health, and relationships. She came onto the show to talk about her newest book, Strong, a relationship field guide for the modern man, which offers practical guidance for navigating contemporary relationships. So without further ado, let's begin. Hello, Kristal. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
How are you today?
Doing pretty good. Yeah,
are you feeling strong?
That's always the goal.
So let's just get this first question out of the way. You wrote a book for men. You identify as a woman. So what brought you to focus on the male experience?
I'm a marriage and family therapist, and one of kind of the positions I end up finding myself in is kind of playing translator a little bit for couples that have communication issues. And, particularly for heterosexual couples, I find myself kind of playing translator a little bit between the male and female partners. And I'm really invested in relational success. So I noticed also that a lot of resources out there for mental health, relationships are very much directed towards women. And I wanted to even the playing field a little bit. So I wrote a book for men from a woman's perspective, as well as, with my marriage and family therapy experience to hopefully, give a little insight to the guys.
So that's so interesting. When you say you're playing translator, are you translating the woman's word so that the men can understand? Or do you find yourself literally just as the medium between both people because they're just not hearing each other?
Yeah, a lot of it is the medium, right? I mean, I think that's sometimes the fear I hear from men is that, they're going to come into therapy and the therapist, especially if it's a woman, is going to be focused on making sure they hear what their wives are saying, which is important, but it's only half of the equation, right? The other piece is also making sure that they feel heard as well. So, yeah, it really is the translator in the middle.
So it's hard to talk about gender differences without falling into stereotypes. But since we are talking about translation and communication, I am curious your feelings on the general stereotypes you have that say women love to communicate and are great at communicate. And then when they sit with their girlfriends, they just chat and gossip all day. Well, a man sees his friend and he goes, dude. And the other one goes, dude. And then they're like, great conversation.
So, it's kind of funny because there is some truth to that, but a lot of it is socialization, right? Because obviously everybody has their own personality. There are some people that are extroverts and they love to talk and be social, and that could be, whatever gender. And then people that are more introverted, a little bit more quiet, a little bit more inward and thoughtful rather than outward and verbal. And so I kind of divide it more into like internal processors and external processors. But sure, on a broad scale, right? The way that we socialize women generally is to communicate with words. And there's, studies about brain structure and language development that, female brains develop language skills faster. They have more intra-hemispheric connections. So they use more words per day. So I think it's a little bit of both and.
I love that distinction between internal processors and external processors because it reminds me of an exercise I sometimes do when I'm leading like retreats or trainings with big groups. And I'll have people finish the question prompt when I'm having a hard time, I like to. And it's either talk to somebody or be on my own. And I do find a lot of times it is 50-50. Like a lot
Yeah,
of people do feel a big desire to work through their problems with somebody else, but other people just want some time to go through it themselves.
absolutely. But then the effect of socialization, you layer socialization on there. And maybe, like, guys aren't maybe socially primed to verbally, externally process vulnerable things like their feelings. Maybe they will start a debate about something interesting and process, externally that way. But yeah, there's a lot of external messages from society about kind of the appropriateness of processing emotions or vulnerable topics.
So I'm hearing you on how guys aren't, as you say, socially primed to verbally externalize their process. Very therapeutic speak right there. What do you say to the guy who's perhaps like afraid to like share their emotions potentially like with their spouse, with their partner, out of fear of, being seen as weak? Oh, they're not going to think of me as this big, strong rock in the relationship. Or another kind of gender stereotype that sometimes happens is like when there's usually another stereotype that the female will like bring up this one thing that was said in an argument like 6 months ago.
Uh-huh.
So like there's also a fear that like what they say might be used against them later.
Yeah, and that's really fair. And one of the things that, I want to make a distinction is, just because somebody's a woman doesn't necessarily mean that they're emotionally intelligent either, right? And so I think that's one of the things when I talk about strong relationships is there are some relationships that they don't really want your emotional connection at all. They want you to fulfill a function, right? So there are some women that do look at men in kind of a objectified way. Like, I want you to make a lot of money. I want you to support my lifestyle. And I really don't care about how you feel. Right. So don't bring that stuff to me. But if that's not what you want in a relationship, if you're a man who wants to cultivate an emotional safety and a deeper connection, then, first having the awareness of what are you then looking for in a partner. And then when you find that person, starting to co-create that sense of emotional safety together from the beginning is so important, so that later on, if you do have kind of high stakes topics to share, you'll feel confident that you have the skills and you have the right partner to do so.
Mm. That's so synchronistic with the topic I've been exploring lately, which is Martin Buber's I it versus I thou relationships
Mm.
or I you relationships. And that's exactly what
Mm-hmm.
he talks about is that we view objects as what they can do for us. This glass can
Mm-hmm.
hold water. My car can take me from point A to point B. And he writes about how easy it is to turn people, not just our partners in our life, into objects, just looking at them at what kind of things can they do for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, in the beginning of my book, I talk about there's really two types of relationships in the world: relationships that are based on function and relationships that are based on connection. And, one is not necessarily, quote, better than another, right? We do need function based transactional relationships to just make the world go around. And, there might be people that are in your life for a function, right? Like, you live next door to a neighbor, maybe you wouldn't have otherwise entered into the same orbit as that person. But then if you work on developing a connection, then it becomes a different type of relationship, right? It's not just, oh yeah, the guy that I see going in and out of the apartment next door. It's somebody who I have a connection to, right? And that's the same thing with relationships, intimate relationships. I find that there are some people that, like you said, they just look at other individuals as objects in a way, like, what can you do for me? And then there are other people that really want to cultivate a deep connection and have a relationship that's based around that. And that's a whole different thing.
That's so interesting. I'd love to bounce two ideas off of you. One is the person who wants to break up with their partner because, quote, I'm not getting my needs met, which again is like, you're not serving the functions that I have put upon you. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
also curious if you feel this is connected to conditional versus conditional love, because many people do believe there is no such thing as unconditional love. And the conditions that we put on our partnerships, such as, I want you to be good lover, good parent, good chef, good thing. These are perfectly natural conditions to have for our relationship.
So it's interesting because I like love can be unconditional, but relationships are not. Right? If that makes sense, right? So you can love somebody and still choose to not be in a relationship with them. And, one of the ways I think it's very maybe that the example can strike home a little bit is like if you have a child who you have unconditional love for, and I know lots of people say, oh, well, that's really the only kind of love that is unconditional, but you still sometimes have to put boundaries on behavior in order to maintain a relationship. So I think that would be two different things. And then the other one, as far as like not getting your needs met in a relationship, I think first of all, there's no wrong like reason to leave a relationship. If you're not happy in it, you can leave a relationship if you want to. But I guess it's kind of being able to, and I really think it goes back to what kind of relationship you're in, and are you and your partner on the same page about what you're bringing into the relationship and why you're in the relationship. Right? Because if you're going into a relationship and the agreement was that you would meet each other's emotional needs and that your relationship would be based on deep connection, and you're not getting your emotional needs met, that's a valid reason to leave the relationship. Same thing, there are people who get into conditional relationships based on function, and they decide that, the function has been fulfilled, they're not getting their needs met anymore, and they choose to leave it. I mean, that's the risk of any human relationship is people are free agents, right?
Yeah. And what's coming up for me is sort of finding that balance when we do enter in a relationship between thinking about what we can get from it and what we can give, what we can offer. And, I don't think anyone wants to go into the bedroom with someone who is only thinking about their own needs.
Yeah. And this is where relationships are complicated, right? But I think it's an opportunity for an ongoing conversation, right? And that's really where, when people say communication issues, it's having those ongoing conversations about who we are to each other, which is something I encourage people to do from the very beginning, because I don't know if many of us realize how ingrained the scripts for relationships are in this society of like, you just are supposed to be in a relationship. That's something you're supposed to want. But, having that self-investigation of, wait a minute, why do I want to be in a relationship? What would be my purpose in doing that? And then what am I prepared to invest into a healthy relationship? Makes a difference when you actually enter into it with that kind of intentionality. And then finding a partner who's also willing to be that intentional with you makes a huge difference.
Yeah, it ties into gender roles for sure in terms of what we are supposed to bring to a relationship or what we think we're supposed to bring to a relationship. And you do write in your book that masculinity used to be about protection, provision, and procreation, but that's no longer the case.
Well, I think it's expressed differently in a modern relationship, right? Or at least in the type of relationship that respects the fact that a woman can also be a provider, right, in the relationship. And that in a healthy relationship, people have each other's back, right? They protect each other and they protect the relationship from any outside threats. And they co-parent. It's not just about procreation, it's about creating a family, right? And raising those kids up and parenting in the long term. So I don't think those things are passe or unnecessary. I just think that there's a little bit of a challenge to how it's being expressed in a modern relationship.
Yeah, it is lovely to see more and more men taking on the warm, loving, fatherly role.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, it used to just be procreation, just get the baby out, and then the mother was in charge.
Yeah. Yeah.
So nowadays we have broken free a bit of those gender roles, but I think as a result, a lot of people are a bit lost. And I'm curious what you envision for the future of gender dynamics in relationships.
I think you're right. Things changed very, very quickly over a very, very short period of time. It's only been a couple of decades since women were really able to exist in society without a male sponsor, really, right?
Mhm.
I think it was even in the 70s that a woman couldn't take out a loan, take out a
Can
line of
open a
credit,
bank
buy a
account.
house. Yeah. And so whether it was a husband, it was a male sponsor, right? So one of the things I remember finding was a woman. She actually had to get her son, her 11-year-old son, to be a co-signer because he was male and she was, not able to have, So again, it's like
Wow.
it seems like, women's rights have come a long way, but it's been a lot of change in a very short period of time. And I think right now is when we're seeing kind of the impact on the men of how fast that change happened and what changed so quickly. And so I think moving forward, there does need to be a little bit of a maybe re-examining of like, what is marriage for? What are relationships for? Because in the past, they were really about survival, right? Like women could not survive in society in a lot of different ways, or they couldn't thrive in society without, having a man by their side. And so marriage, and in many cases, was fairly utilitarian. And America, there's a lot of romance in the society as well, but I think maybe there's a conversation that needs to be had about the balance here of, rather than just jumping from romance to romance or marrying somebody for utilitarian reasons, is there a middle ground where there are two healthy adults who are equally invested in sharing these roles?
I love that. So before we get into this idea of a strong relationship and a strong marriage, it is an acronym. And I'm curious, what brought you to focusing on these elements? What brought you to this idea of strong?
So I love acronyms. First of all, I think they're make hard concepts easy to remember. And also, I wanted to create a model that was strength focused, right? So, in becoming a therapist, one of the things I was very aware of was that it tends to be highly overrepresented with women. A lot of resources are, kind of tailored towards female audiences. And I wanted to emphasize that being good at relationships is a really strong thing to have in your toolbox, right? It's like, studies that I reference in the book, and just, multiple studies have shown that the quality of your relationships determines the quality of your life. So being able to be strong as a human being includes being able to be strong in a relational sense. And then the elements are, from my schooling in couples therapy and relationship systems and attachment theory. But then also, when I became a therapist 10 years ago, it was kind of just the very beginning of trauma-informed, modalities and awareness of the impact of trauma. And one thing that trauma really impacts is somebody's sense of safety. And so when I was doing couples therapy, that was, you can focus on trust, you can focus on repair, you can focus on respect, you can focus on communication skills. But ultimately, if people don't really feel safe in the relationship, and not just physical safety, but that safety to be themselves, the freedom to be vulnerable, the ability to regulate when they're upset or having an argument, you really are kind of putting the cart before the horse. And so that's why with this acronym, the S, the very beginning, the foundation of a healthy relationship is safety. And then everything else builds from that.
So earlier we mentioned protection and provision. And how is that different than safety? Because I feel like a lot of people are like, yes, it's my job to keep my family safe, to keep my wife safe.
Yeah, I wanted to honor that urge, right? It's like, you want to keep your family safe, you want to protect them, but what does that actually mean in real life, right? And a lot of this is where then kind of coming into the couples experience is, it might sound good as a concept. And like in the past, sure, like, being physically strong to like fight a wolf or a lion, or, to kill a moose so that you could eat dinner, physical strength as a marker of masculinity was one of those kind of things that everybody was like, oh yeah, that's what strength means. That's what protection means. You got to be able to beat up the bad guys. But, again, in real life, how many, like, it's not exactly like an everyday skill, right? But being able to have a difficult conversation in a safe way, being able to have an emotional conversation or a conversation about repair in a way that's safe, like those are emotional ways that you can protect your partner. And also, protecting your partner from yourself if there are things that you do that damage the relationship. That's a way that you can be a protector and provide emotional safety and stability for your partner and for your family in a healthy relationship as a man in a modern sense.
That reminds me of a very silly story. One time I was on a road trip and we were hearing like gunshots where we were, and I was like, "What's going on?" And then I looked it up, and we were nearby a shooting range. And a guy gave it's a kind of Google Maps, right? So a guy gave the shooting range 5 stars, and he was like, "A great place to practice protecting your family." I was like, "Huh, that's so interesting." So to this guy, yeah, being able to handle a firearm and to be a good marksman is a good way, to protect your home and protect your family. While obviously having a gun in the home is very dangerous for kids, also for parents who might experience, say, a mental health crisis, and then that gun is much more likely to become a weapon on the family. So here's something somebody feels like they need to feel safe, but what are the true foundations of safety and creating safety in a relationship?
Yeah. So I break it down into 4 skills. The first skill is self awareness, right? Because if you are self aware of the way that you're showing up in the relationship, you can then be aware of the impact on your partner. Also, one of the things that I saw caused a lot of insecurity, a lack of safety in a relationship, is when somebody was in a relationship that they weren't really committed to. And so the self awareness piece is kind of investigating that question. Are you with this person because you want to be with them or because you just ended up in this relationship? And if so, no wonder they're getting kind of insecure because you're not really here, right? So that's the self-awareness piece. How are you showing up in the relationship? The second one is stability, basic life skills. Again, like, yeah, it's super cool if you can, like, I don't know, shoot a perfect, bullseye every time, but do you know how to do your laundry and, like, do basic, can you cook for your children? Do you know where they go to school? And, again, these might be kind of hyperbolic or seem like eye rolling, but this is something that when it comes to the daily, everyday grind, a lot of women express a lot of frustration around having partners who don't have the basic skills to maintain the stability of their home if they go down. So, like, if a woman gets sick, some of the stories of, like, the husband is like, "Oh, I'm so sorry you're not feeling well. Hey, what's for dinner, by the way?" Or, "Hey, I'm so sorry that, you're not feeling good, but,
Sorry, you're stuck in bed, but what's for dinner?
Exactly. And so that kind of stuff, it just erodes the stability of the home because, if your partner can't rely on you to keep the home fires burning, I mean, that takes a toll on the relationship. It's basically, I can't trust that you would keep our family or our home or our kids safe. I have to do it. Right. So if the woman is in charge of that level of the stability of the family, it becomes a little bit unbalanced in the home. And then the last 2 S's of safety, what I call them, is self-regulation and then self-expression, right? So the ability to, if these are kind of the communication and conflict. Do you know how to have communication and conflict in a safe way? Or is your default yelling, screaming, name calling? None of those things contribute to an environment of safety in your relationship or in your home. So if you get those 4 things under your belt, that's kind of the elements of a safe relationship.
Self awareness, stability, self regulation, and self expression. So I don't want to go through the whole thing. I want to encourage people to explore further in your book. Let's just go to the T in this acronym, which is trust. So, how do we build trust in a relationship?
So, building trust is one of those things that everybody agrees is foundational for a healthy relationship. But one of the things about trust is knowing how to repair when you've made a mistake. Right. So, in an ideal world, in a perfect world, you would show up perfectly. Your word would be, your bond and everything would be exactly right from the beginning. We're all human, right? There are going to be times where we make a promise, we forget about it, or we think we're going to do something and we let our partner down. And all of those things can damage the trust that our partners have in us unless we also have the skills to repair, right? And so I talk about trust as like it's the bond between you and your partner. And the more threads you have between you, the stronger the bridge, right? And sometimes, yeah, a thread will fail, but do you have the skills to repair it? Do you have more? And then also kind of thinking about how much burden you place on that trust, right? And instead, and I say this in the book, of like, are you instead relying on your partner to believe you rather than working hard to earn the trust and to build a strong foundation of trust between the 2 of you?
So, I wouldn't mind integrating or thinking about how these factors of safety and trust relate to attachments and attachment styles, and perhaps even trauma, because first, we already talked about how safety is crucial to relationships. And I feel like to perhaps an anxiously attached person, they never really feel safe. They're always worried that something's going to happen. Meanwhile, an avoidantly attached person often has a distrust of close relationships. And you already did mention that those who have experienced trauma do have a really hard time feeling any sense of safety. I feel like that's almost both of them. Neither safety nor trust. They don't have
Yeah.
good past patterning to cultivate these qualities.
Yeah, which is, again, I think something that is so important to be aware of, right? Is, sometimes people have this idea that we just kind of enter into our adult relationships as clean slates, when that's really not the case, right? We learn about relationships and the safety or the security of them or the trustworthiness of people, from infancy, before we're even aware that we're learning these things. And so that is something I always just want to say, like, hey, be gentle with yourselves, be gentle with each other, because, that can be playing a large part in what you're experiencing in the relationship. But the other thing I always like to mention is that attachment styles are not diagnoses. Like, this is what you learned about relationships from an environment that maybe didn't provide you with that safety and security that you needed, or with the trustworthy adult. But now that you're an adult and you can choose to be in a relationship, you can choose a trustworthy and safe person. And that's where then you and that person can cultivate a healthy and strong and safe and trustworthy connection with each other. So, attachment styles, they kind of set a precedent, but it's not set in stone, right? I like to think of it as like the default, but you can actively choose to change kind of your existing relationships. Yeah, it's the power of choice.
Yeah, it's a very helpful message. No matter what your past is, you can still choose to be in a loving relationship in the present. So, popping over to the end, which is nurturing, I want to contrast that with how earlier we were talking about how many men feel a call to be a provider and might even feel a sense of inadequacy when they're not providing, right? When like they lose their job and they lose a sense of their manhood, we might say. And how is nurturing different than providing?
So I think it's an aspect of providing, right? Because right now, a lot of men, when they talk about providing, they're talking about a single specific aspect, which is financial. And providing is so much bigger than that, right? And that's what I really want to encourage, is that men are more than just wallets and paychecks. They have so many more skills and so many more valuable things that they can provide to their families, right? Because I just, when you said that, something popped up for me. I was like, how many people like can tell you or can, name how much money their dad made, right? Versus how many people can think back on how their dad showed up for them, and like which one actually like matters when it comes to feeling provided for, right? Because I know lots of people that are like, oh yeah, my dad made money, yeah, he paid our bills, but I didn't really know the guy, as opposed to other people that are like, yeah, my mom maybe had the higher paying job, my dad kind of went in and out of different jobs, but man, he was always there. He was like so present. He was, there at every game, and, always just checking in on me and just providing me with such a sense of stability and support. And I always felt comfortable talking to him. And, even now I can call him and, he's got some just words of wisdom, and like, that's really what I want to emphasize is, you're more than just a paycheck. If anything, that could be like the least interesting thing about you, right? Like being present, providing your presence as a dad is so important. I mean, there are lots of men, same thing, that provide paychecks for children they never see. And they, there's so much more to being a father than simply providing a paycheck.
Absolutely. It reminds me of those 5 regrets of the dying that nurse published. And a major one was, I wish I hadn't worked so much. Like, you're not going to remember the extra nights at the office. You're going to remember, yeah, when you went to the recital, when you were there for the first words, the first steps, when you were actually present, making memories with your family.
Absolutely. And that's something, I talk about in the nurturing chapter is, for men to leave a legacy, right? It's like leaving your mark, is more than just like spreading your DNA or working to put your name on a building somewhere, or, it's like these two things are kind of the outliers, right? But every single man can leave a legacy of memory, of impact, of presence, of purpose, right? And so what's that other saying? It's like, a man dies twice, once when he dies physically and once when the last person speaks his name. And if you think about it, if you are present as a father, that impact, that legacy lives on, right? Then they tell stories about grandfather, great grandfather, and then, they just like that living legacy is incredible and it can be impactful, but not if you're not there. Not if even your own children barely speak your name because they don't remember you.
I love that. We can all leave a legacy of presence, purpose, and sweet, sweet memories. So, just to contextualize this idea of building a strong relationship, we have this incredible acronym: safety, trust, respect, openness, nurturing, and generosity. And these are qualities that a man would focus on cultivating and bringing into the relationship to make it strong.
Yeah.
Okay. So, follow-up question to that is, what do you think a strong book for women would look like? Would it have the same acronyms?
Yeah. Yeah. And so when I do my couples work, obviously I work with heterosexual couples, I work with gay couples, lesbian couples, I work with all kinds of different relational structures. And strong is just kind of the fundamental underpinning, I think, of a healthy relationship. It's kind of like strong is healthy, no matter who embodies it, right? Because men also deserve to feel safe with their partners. They also need to find partners who they can trust in and feel that trust reciprocated, to feel respected in their relationships and have that mutual respect. So I think it's kind of one size fits all when it comes to what it means to be strong and build a strong relationship. Yeah, I don't want it to feel like, only men have to live up to this standard, because, one person doing all the work themselves is not a healthy relationship either.
So, as we're winding down, I'm just thinking about, again, the gender stereotype that men are just simple-minded, or like simple folks, like, just tell me what to do. Just tell me what to say to my wife. So, I'm hearing self-awareness, stability, self-regulation, self-expression. What is like a concrete step or actionable plan that I could make to make my relationship strong?
Yeah, I would say a very simple one that almost immediately, well, there's two coming up, but let me start with one, is what I call like the heartbeat, right? So it's like my little heartbeat exercise. I have it in the book, but it's like if your emotional connection is kind of flatlined, or you're not even sure, like, I don't even know where to start as a guy, like, just tell me what to do. I don't know where to start. It's like, well, start with like the little heartbeat of emotional connection. So checking in with your partner daily about a point of pride that they had, a point of pain, and then a point of pleasure. And so I kind of like, if your emotional connection is flatlined, like, this is one way to just like kickstart a little like bump of connection. Because also,
like a little check-in.
Yeah, a little check-in. So a point of pride, a point of pain, and a point of pleasure. Being available for their pain and not avoiding it, right? And not sugarcoating it, or not trying to, hard things happen, let's move on. But really being present for that and providing care. And then pleasure, which is a connective experience, right? So it's like your partner's like, oh, I just, found this new show that I'm super into, or, showing that you're curious about them and that their pleasure also like makes you happy is also a really connective experience.
I love that. Point of pride, point of pain, and point of pleasure, and how each time we kind of receive that little tidbit of information. With the pride, we become a cheerleader. With the pain, we become available, compassionate, and present. And with the pleasure, we become happy and connected.
Yeah, playful.
Playful.
Yeah.
You're good at the alliteration, I have to say. So that was the first one. Did you say there was a second one that came to mind?
Oh, the second one is kind of the 4 positions of conversation. Is, one thing I noticed is if, let's say a partner is like had a bad day and she just wants to vent, and their maybe the male partner is trying to offer a solution and it doesn't land well. It's one of those very common things that lead to fights or conflict. So being able to kind of just remember there are 4 positions of conversation. Position 1 is just listening. Position 2 is joining, so empathetic. empathizing. Position 3 is offering a solution, fixing. And then position 4 is debating, playing devil's advocate, right? But if you start at position 4, unless your relationship is pretty clearly solid, you're going to have a bad time. So I always just recommend just start at position 1 and work through, or ask, which position do you want me in? I hear you telling me about a problem. Do you want a solution, or do you want me to validate how hard it was? Join with you, right? Or do you want me to just listen and nod so that you can keep going? Because maybe you have a lot to share. And so just checking in with your partner, 4 positions of conversation. So you're not playing the wrong game.
Does anyone even choose the debating one? Do we ever want to debate?
It's so interesting because the way that men bond with each other is often through debate, right? So it's a very kind of I notice that when women talk to each other, they tend to stick to positions 1 and 2. I mean, again, in the kind of classic socialization, a woman will listen to her friend and then be like, oh my gosh, that was so hard. I can remember something like that happened to me. I'm so sorry that's happening to you. Whereas men tend to go to positions 3 and 4. And so I think that's also something I like to highlight is, heterosexual relationships is a challenge in communicating across these 2 skill sets. So
I love that. Listening, joining, offering solutions, or debating. And just before we close, as a therapist, which role do you find is most useful for the therapeutic process?
I generally am in positions 1 and 2, right? Until the therapeutic rapport is developed. Then often kind of shifting to the reframe, right? Maybe not necessarily offering solutions, but tools so that people can kind of work towards their own solutions. But a lot of, again, this is the relationship building is often just positions 1 and 2, listening, validating, allowing people to feel seen and heard. Because until you do that, nobody really wants your solutions or your alternative facts. Right?
I love that. Yes, relationship building involves listening and joining. Well, thank you so much, Kristal DeSantis, author of Strong, a relationship field guide for the modern man. I do have to finish by asking the same question I ask all of my guests, which is, what do you wish everyone knew about love?
You have to fight for it. Love is a beautiful thing, and it's hard work to maintain. So I think that's something. Just thinking about my practice, I wish people knew that love was not enough to make a long-term relationship work. It takes work.
So you often find yourself wishing your clients were putting up more of a fight or putting more work into the relationship?
Yeah, there's a concept from Esther Perel that I use very often is there's a difference between a love story and a life story. And I think that's what I wish more people knew is that, we sometimes overemphasize the romanticism of the love story, right? Like movies, TV, all of this stuff is but to make that love story a life story takes fight, it takes work, it takes skill.
Well, thank you so much, Kristal DeSantis, for coming onto the show. For our listeners who want to learn more about you, how can they find you?
You can find me on Instagram or my website, strong.love.
Nice. Strong.love. Kristal DeSantis, everybody, author of Strong, a relationship field guide for the modern man. Thank you so much for coming on. I like your very straightforward, open, and compassionate approach to the unique challenges that we all encounter in relationships. And I appreciate the work that you're doing with men. We have a lot of work to do, and that's what it takes to love. You got to put in the work. You got to fight for it.
Thank you for having me on and for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you remember all of the valuable lessons that Kristal shared with us today, including love can be unconditional, but relationships are not. When we are going through challenging emotions, there tend to be internal processors and external processors. There are 2 types of relationships, those based on function and those based on connection. And being a strong human means being strong in relationships. So make your relationship strong by bringing safety, trust, respect, openness, nurturing, and generosity into your relationships. Safety is based on self-awareness, stability, self-regulation, and self-expression. Trust means knowing how to repair when you've made a mistake. Don't worry, attachment styles are not diagnoses. They can change as soon as you choose and be with a trustworthy and safe person. Every man can leave behind a legacy of sweet memories, impact, presence, and purpose. And love is a beautiful thing, but it takes work to maintain. And I also hope you remember, listeners, you are perfect just the way you are. You are lovable, loving, and loved.
Thanks again for listening to the Learn to Love podcast. To learn more about the show and your host, head over to zachbeach.com or theheartcenter.com. You can also follow Zach on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.